How do you change an organization to be more inclusive without rendering diversity, equity, and inclusion as a challenge or a problem? This is what this episode is all about. Hi, welcome to the School of Becoming. My name is Ingo Rao, and together with an amazing board of advisors and supporters, we bring you this season on activating inclusion that is supported by Manage Magazine. In this episode, Tinna, Nielsen and Lisa Kepinski will talk to us about inclusion nudges. It is also the name of a global initiative with the aim of making us more inclusive using nudges. And with that, tackling our unconsciousness to make us behave in more inclusive ways. In the session, Tinna and Lisa will share with us a couple of practical nudges that you can use in your organization. Knowing social psychology and anthropology, Lisa and Tinna will not only share these practical nudges, but also explain to us the psychology behind them. With that, welcome Tinna and Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We want to share some very specific examples with you of how we can all contribute to creating an inclusive culture in our workplaces and in our communities. And we want to share with you this change and design approach and methodology that Lisa and I have developed over the years. We call inclusion nudges. So we can nudge ourselves, our unconscious mind, and that of others to automatically do inclusiveness in everything we do. And so we pick some practical examples for you today. And but we actually also want to give you examples that's relevant for you, those of you participating here today. So that brings us to this question.
So here's your chance to please go to the chat section. And as you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion work, or however you frame it up in your context, what is the challenge or challenges that you're experiencing? So if you could type in your challenges into the chat section, this will give Tinna and I some context that we will decide. We shared with Ingo, we have several examples, but we may actually not show any of them based on what you're typing into the chat. So if you could type into the chat right now, what are the kinds of challenges that you're experiencing as you do diversity, equity, and inclusion work within your sphere of influence?
Yeah. And you might actually not be, as such, responsible for that kind of work. You might just be working in an organization or living in a community, and you want to make a change for the greater good of all of us. So what can you actually do? That can also be one of the challenges you're experiencing. Exactly. As you're writing in the chat, Lisa and I are going to share two challenges that we were facing when we were both working internally in big multinational organizations. And so every time we've shared something, Lisa and I, in this session today, we're gonna also give you time to air your voice and share some of your experiences. So after we've given you some of these examples of the challenges we've experienced, but also how we dealt with them, we want to share a little bit about the theory and the science behind this approach of inclusion nudges. We want to share with you a little bit about these behavioral and social insights very briefly. We also would like to share some practical examples, and then also how you can take this forward. But again, rest assured, we're gonna keep framing this up around what you think is important for us to talk about today. Again, I want to just start with an example that of a challenge I experienced when I was working in a multinational organization. So I had the global responsibility of making sure we had an inclusive culture, that we treated each other with respect. We actually invited each other's different perspectives and knowledge and know-how into how we solved the problems in the organization or created our services or our products, and how we actually leverage that and we're inclusive of that diversity to make better decisions and better solutions. But it was also about, removing any kind of unacceptable behavior, discrimination, harassment, and making sure everybody had equal opportunities. But for me, I was just noticing that thousands of people every year in the employee engagement survey were actually saying that they were experiencing this kind of unacceptable behavior. And I knew that the leaders in the organization knew about this because they watched and looked at the same data year after year. They also saw the increase in this, but no action were taken. So I decided to do it differently this time. Also, because a lot of times I experienced that I was being shot as a messenger when I brought in this unpleasant message in the executive team meetings, making a call to action, something needed to happen. They would shoot me and we would get nowhere. Or they would head into this heated discussion about the legal definition of discrimination, indirect discrimination, instruction to discriminate, and sexual harassment. Surely none of those examples or data would fit into that category. And then they dismissed it as an issue and we moved on. So I was, I needed to do something different. So what I did was I created what I call the speech bubble intervention. I collected the stories of people who experienced this on a daily basis, also the people who had left the organization due to this. And we had those examples from the exit interviews. And I also called people up and asked them if I could interview them about this. So I gave the people a voice. And I wrote their stories for them in first-person quotes. I printed them out in big speech bubbles, and I decorated the entire executive conference room from floor to ceiling with all these speech bubbles with these personal stories. And as they entered the room, I said to them, your people, your employees, your colleagues, they have something to share with you. And they started reading these examples, and what happened was a completely new experience for me, because when they started talking, they were not talking to me. They were not shooting me as a messenger, because now I wasn't any longer the messenger. The people were the messengers, and they were listening to the voices, and they started talking to each other. And the leaders were speaking about emotions, how awful this was to read, how painful it was to know that this was going on and they didn't even realize, how saddened they were that their staff would experience this on a daily basis. Some were angry, some felt nauseated. But the point was, it actually got access to where the empathy was, and also access to the feeling of physical discomfort, which is a very motivational factor. I also reversed the numbers. I humanized the numbers. I said, 12% of people, that's the same as, and then I made it into a number. Instead of 12%, it became 4,239 people going to work here every day. And so I humanized the numbers, and I also I triggered the loss aversion bias in the human mind, which is about, we don't want to lose things. We're really miserable losing something more than we're actually happy gaining the exact same thing. So there was a motivational factor in that as well. I said to them, when a person experiences this kind of behavior every day, they lose about 30% of their decision-making power. If one in a team of 8 experience this kind of behavior and an unacceptable treatment every day, the productivity of the entire team drops by 12%. And so this was insights from data, but instead of talking about all the stuff we could gain from changing this, it was also about what are we losing and missing out on right now. So there were several of these behavioral interventions. This led to them putting this on the agenda in every leadership team in the entire organization. They decided to send this intervention, the speech bubble intervention, on a tour in the entire organization. And one of the managers said, I do not want this experience to disappear on a spreadsheet. I want everybody in this organization to feel what we just felt. I want them to be motivated to take action and go out there and involve and engage everybody to change the culture of this organization, because either they experience this kind of unacceptable behavior, they witness this, or they do it. This got to change, and they have the solutions. So they started rolling this out, and it became local change initiatives in local cultures instead of everybody having to globally comply to the same standard or solution, because it wouldn't work anyway. So that was just one example of how we can all actually be part of changing the culture. So I want to hand this over to Lisa to share how she made a cultural change in the organization where she worked.
Great, thanks. And there's been a lot of good challenges that you will have been typing. I've also been writing briefly on the paper next to me. And Tinna, we're going to have a wealth actually of examples that we might be able just to quickly adapt to and just give examples.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. Go ahead.
So
Share your example. That
I'll
might
share my
inspire.
example.
Yeah, that might inspire more to share some.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So this is when I was also, like Tinna said, we started and most of our career has been internal in organizations, heading up diversity, equity, and inclusion functions. And I was in one, and it was an opportunity. It was a startup of the function and to start up many initiatives. And I reported into the CEO. So it was fabulous in terms of position, access to the CEO, a lot of endorsement. Yes, let's do this or this. And they had in their mind that they really wanted a mentoring program, which I'm not necessarily a big fan of. It's a great development tool, but it is not the tool to be used for promotion. And in this case, they were trying to increase women in very senior levels. And so I was regularly into the executive committee meetings that happened every quarter, where executives would fly in from around the world to headquarters. And I did a session explaining for them, because there's a degree of education that we all need to do as change makers, and a bit around what's the difference between mentoring and sponsorship. And I got a lot of like, oh, okay, I get that perspective, that the mentoring is a development tool and the sponsorship is actually a career decision tool and readiness and advocacy whenever you're doing promotion or succession planning. And so they got their role, and they saw the connection to their intentions, which was to increase women at senior levels. So the mandate was kind of given to me, like, okay, let's start the program. When you come back next quarter to our executive committee, we will go ahead and launch a sponsorship program. So, you know, I was to come in with the high potential women. We were looking at CEO level and above, and it was going to go forward. Well, in the kind of few weeks, not so far after the meeting happened, and I was traveling heavily in that role, those were the days. As I would go to different locations and meet with the CEOs for the business units in those countries, or I'd have kind of indirect conversations with their HR managers supporting them, I started hearing comments like, yeah, you know, we get sponsorship, but you know, I don't really do anything different for men, so why should I do something different for women? Or I'm not really sure this is going to be needed. I mean, let's just leave things as they are. It's kind of working well from their perspective. I mean, there was this constant kind of messaging and eroding of that support that I got the head nodding in the previous meeting. And I said, ugh, this is really showing a sign of they haven't gotten it at a deep level, in a space where there was strong commitment around the initiative. And what I did was I was presenting information to them in that meeting. It was all appealing to their rational brain, their thinking, their educating, the definition, the positioning. I said, I've got to do something different in this next meeting, or else this is going to become one more diversity inclusion activity that's just kind of like, one of you were typing here about superficial level and leadership support. Yeah, this was going to become that. What I did instead, when I started the meeting, is I went in and I had done work with the talent manager, and we went into our online talent system where everyone had uploaded a photograph. So I selected out the pool, male and female, for this sponsorship program at the level which would have been the pipeline into CEO. And I pulled all the images there. So all the images, this is just a fictitious one that Tinna and I created. I had roughly about 125 people that were in that pool, and I put all 25 photos there. And so, we've got a dog joined us. Okay, thanks for muting. And so I had all 125 images of people that were in that pool. And I started off the meeting, the executive meeting, with asking one question. And I said, so how many of these people do you know? And they got very competitive, and they were shouting out the names, John Clear, Plod, they're going all the names. And, they were like seeing who knew who more. And I quickly shut it down after about 3 or 4 minutes. I mean, this is this, uber competitive space of the executive leadership team. And I then went to the next slide. Tinna, can you advance to the next slide? And I said, so how many of these people do you know? So what had happened is I faded out the male photos, and retain the female photos. And in that original pool of 125 talents that were ready for that level, there were less than 20 in that particular case that were female. And their answers to the question, when I asked on this slide, so how many of these people do you know? They only knew 2 of them. And they instantly got it, kind of like a kick in the gut, that I didn't have to kick them. It was themselves realizing their lack of visibility to the full talent pool, and especially their lack of visibility to the women in the talent pool. And what happened, I didn't have to take it to the next step of the conversation. The executives took over this discussion about sponsorship because they were already informed what was sponsorship from the previous meeting. They redesigned the sponsorship program. They said, every person needs to have 2 executive sponsors, one from her own business unit and one from another business unit within the organization, because they had an issue of talent hoarding, keeping their talent within their own business units. And they felt like by having exposure to 2 executives who were advocating for them would also help to break down silos between the business and encourage more opportunities overall across this multinational. Mm-hmm. The next talent review cycle was 7 months later, and 3 women were promoted to CEO. This overall executive for this multinational shared with me, none of us knew those 3 women before this sponsorship program happened. This intervention has stuck with them, and it stuck with them throughout the time that they did not have full visibility. So as Tina referenced, this kind of shoot the messenger for us as change makers is a real dynamic that we often face. And we need to employ techniques like Tina did and I did, where we're revealing the experience within the organization, the voices within the organization, so that where bias shows up can be seen, but also done in a way that we're not pointing our finger and saying, you are biased. So that was the example of how I employed this design to feel the need to make the change happen. And immediately I had the process there of the sponsorship initiative, and they took over actually the process instead of me having to push it.
Mm-hmm. And I think what's very interesting about your example, Lisa, is the data also showed that there were other people invisible, because those who were working in the headquarter and had the nationality where the headquarter was located, they also had more visibility. So you could actually also have done this intervention with people who were not located or in the country of the headquarter, or didn't have that nationality. You could have done it on race, ethnicities.
And Tina, to that point, we have in the guidebook where we've spotted this being used with music festivals as a design to call out. And they're looking at a couple of lenses. What would the program of the music festival look like? And there are, initially we saw it looking at gender, but then they expanded it around sexual orientation and non-binary in terms of the people who are scheduled for the performers. They looked at race, they looked at nationality. So it's a technique that actually, and what we like about inclusion nudges is how they show that you can apply them in one context. This was inside a corporate boardroom to a music festival in the UK. So it's something to also think about as you hear the examples we have to share. Everything has its own context to be adapted to, but the design itself and the behavioral science behind it is what helps to guide to make that transition over.
Yeah. And so these 2 examples that we just shared with you, this was not something we called inclusion nudge. When we first shared this with each other, this was back in 2013. Lisa and I met each other for the first time online in an online meeting. And we were exchanging with each other how we were actually applying behavioral insights and behavioral and social science designs in our work. And that it turned out had the biggest impact than when we tried to rationally convince people this was important or make programs and projects around this. And that was actually the kickstarting of what we today call the Inclusion Nudges nonprofit global initiative, which is really about sharing these examples of very practical designs, evidence, science-based designs, and something that others have done to create change, proven some kind of change. And that's what this initiative is about, that we empower each other and that we spread these practical ways we can make it happen. And that's about how we can nudge the unconscious mind to do it automatically, and how we can motivate people to become allies and do it because it makes sense, because they see what they couldn't see before. So the mission we're on is really, how can we make inclusion the norm without having to talk about it all the time? How can we make it the norm, the default everywhere for everyone and by everyone? Because we need everybody engaged in this to actually make it happen. So let's just pause for a moment, because this might have triggered some interesting sharings in the chat. Lisa, I'm going to leave it over to you to capture some of that.
Maybe what I'll do to bring Tinna up to speed, all of you can see the chat, but Tinna, some themes that are being expressed around the challenges are ageism from all spectrums of the generations around age. That's a challenge. The mindset that diversity equals less quality of performance, and then falling back on quotas as what needs to be there. There is a challenge around what the perception is, the slow pace of change with diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and relative to a larger organization that's seemingly at a fast speed of change. So it's matching that. When when leadership feels superficial, and then the leaders get defensive when they hear that feedback. So it's this is about my words, not written here, the gap between the intentions and the action and the credibility piece. Unconscious bias, someone wrote, as a challenge. And also someone wrote about their work integrating international staff and their family into the local community whenever they move in. And then there's quite a bit of examples that have been put here since we've been sharing this, that they resonated with the examples. They're sharing other resources. So for those of you who haven't looked at the chat, take a look. Someone's referencing Sterling K. Brown's 1 Million Truths initiative also for giving voice to the unvoiced. There was a question also, Tinna, would you have been treated the same way in the intervention if you were a person of color? I think it's an intriguing question to be asking about, and we certainly know that leadership teams have their perceptions of us as change makers, and then we bring ourselves into this work, and we're having to constantly work how we show up in these conversations, how they see us, how we design so that also we're not caught up into this dialogue, that it's more about revealing the patterns for them to see. And we have many examples where we're revealing patterns, that the focus is on their own behavior, the data, rather than us as the change maker coming into the room.
Okay, can I call a timeout?
Yes, and that's it.
Because there's a lot. I mean, I love it. It's a very active group of people. Just love it.
I think we might want to open the mics even up.
I'd actually like us to also share a little bit about the difference between when we're trying to convince people or speaking to the rational mind with data and evidence instead of nudging. I want just to make sure that everybody on this session today understands the difference, because it's a massive difference. I want to just speak to a few of the comments right now, if that's okay, and Lisa, join me in this. Would us have been treated the same way if would have been of color? I have no idea if that would have been the case, but I actually believe it wouldn't have been made a difference what skin color you had, because the power of that speech bubble intervention was, as a facilitator, I hardly had a role. Like I was not the focus of attention like I would normally have to be in those kind of situations where I had to like present a business case or present the data and then convince the rational mind to do something, which was never going to work anyway. I think what's interesting about this is the speech bubble intervention has, since this was designed in 2011, actually spread worldwide, globally. It's being used by refugees in refugee camps. It's being used inside the United Nations. It's being used in big multinational organizations and tiny local communities. And it is really about each of us being able to make a bigger difference by not being the facilitator as such. because it kind of gives that voice to the people. And so I'm just going to leave it right there for now. But I think what I experience and the feedback we get is it doesn't make a difference who you are as the facilitator of that intervention, because you're not any longer the messenger. And that is what we know from nudging and behavioral economics and behavioral science in general, that who the messenger is has a major impact on how people are motivated to take action, instead of fostering this kind of resistance and attacking back on the one bringing the message.
Yeah, and I would also just quickly add in there that we've also seen this we work with a lot of hierarchical based cultures. So in terms of who has power and who does not, then a lot of times what we see is the change maker for inclusion and diversity are oftentimes lower in that hierarchy, and they're not holding the power. And what they've found is that these design techniques help to, as Tinna said, and in my example as well, we're almost moved off to the side. We're not the focal point. It is the patterns that surface and the aha experience where the people who are the decision makers, in this case higher in the hierarchy, are the ones that start realizing it and take over, then carrying it forward to the next step. So it is leading into co-creation and redesign. And you're right, Tinna, we need to kind of touch on the thinking piece.
So the reason why these two examples that we just shared works is because it touches on two very important things when it comes to behavioral change. And so evidence shows, and have shown for 4 decades by now, if not 5 decades actually, that change doesn't happen when people rationally get it and analyze and then do it. It comes when we see things that are invisible to us, when it triggers feeling and emotions. It can be surprise or disgust or nausea or eagerness to change something. See, feel, and do, that's the way to get people moving. And also, the easier we can make it for people to do something, the more likely it is that they're actually going to do it. And that's where nudging comes into the equation. Lisa, do you want to talk to why this works in terms of the two systems?
Yes, I was just getting ready to type.
But you're welcome. You keep going with the chat. Okay. I can do this. You want me to go?
Yes, please.
I'll go. Okay, cool. So the reason why this works is because the human mind, and as human beings, we're not rationally thinking human beings. We don't make well-informed decisions as we all tend to think that we do. We have actually two systems in our mind that are working at the same time, but they're not always working together. So we have the unconscious mind. Somebody in the chat already wrote about unconscious bias. So the unconscious mind is an automatic, fast-thinking system. It's actually not even thinking. It's an instinctive, intuitive system that's more reacting. So when we hear a noise or we see a person, our mind will go into a mental shortcut in a split second, 200 milliseconds, jump to conclusion. Should I stay? Is it safe for me to be around these people? Should I attack? Should I defend myself? Should I just, stay cool and listen to what they say? All of this is playing out all the time. So it's like a survival kind of mode of reacting and being in the world. But it's also a super powerful part of our system because we don't have to make an effort. It actually keeps us safe in the streets too. It makes us really good at collaborating as well. But there are also a lot of challenges in this mind. Then we also have the rational mind, the conscious mind, which is a more slow thinking mind. That's where our self-reflection is. That's where we can analyze complex things. We tend to think that if we just make people understand the need, if we just present the business case about why inclusion and equal opportunities and diversity is so important, and it's logic that we support this, that we change our behavior to really tap into the potential of all this, we tend to think if people just get it, they're going to change. And they, of course, they want to be a part of changing the culture, but that's not how it works because of this. it's system one, the unconscious mind, that's our doer. That's where a majority of our behavior is controlled. Whereas system two is really just the guide. When we get it, we can kind of guide us in the right direction, but it's not the part of the brain doing it. If we overload that system with too much information, it does the opposite. It makes a paralysis of the brain and making, system one just stay put because it has a preference for similar others, people who look like ourselves. It has a preference for anything that we recognize, status quo, and that's why we're not moving. So again, we have to find a way to balance these two brain systems to actually make some change. So if I just want to bring you back to the speech bubble intervention, when we take this approach, majority of what happens in that intervention is about targeting system one, the unconscious mind. You have to change the messenger because it changes who we listen to. Now it becomes a part of my tribe. It's my people, it's my staff, it's my employees, it's my colleagues. That's the tribal mentality that we want to trigger. When we hear the stories of people from our tribe that are being treated badly or discriminated or being excluded, it actually triggers a part of the unconscious mind where physical pain and empathy is. This is very important to trigger to get any kind of movement and behavioral change and cultural change. And also we humanize the numbers because the unconscious mind, the doer, doesn't care about numbers. It cares about people. It cares about real human beings. So that's why we have to humanize the numbers, not just make it about 12%. It also triggers that loss aversion bias that I touched on before. And also it was about simple actions. Get it on a tour, get it into the team meetings, and then get people involved. Not a grand, big 10-year plan for how we should change this. It's more important to make it easy to do something to get people started and not overload people with too many things. I knew that there were 15 things we had to fix to change the culture, but I needed them to find their way first, because as soon as they start moving, it's much more likely that you can build more on it instead of just paralyze them from the beginning. So back to the two brain systems. System one controls about 90 to 99% of everything we do. The rational mind, only about 1 to 10%. So keep in mind, researchers worldwide are still debating, how big a percentage this is, but we know it's big. So if we want that movement, that cultural change, we need to get to the unconscious mind. And so before we go on and give some more examples and elaborate a little bit more on this, we want to share a story with you. I know that some of you might have heard this story before. When we've shared the story with you, we're going to check for some patterns together, and we want you to remember how you reacted the first time you heard this. So it goes like this. A father and his son was driving home from a party, and they get into a car accident. And the father passes away, he dies, and the son is seriously injured and taken to the hospital. And when the doctor comes into the emergency room to attend the patient, the doctor says, "I can't treat him. He's my son." So the question to you is, who's the doctor? And so we're going to look for some patterns now. I'm going to do a poll. I'm going to have Ingo take over the screen again and share the poll with you.
Yeah, so I just launched a poll. Everybody should see it, and you should be able to vote. And we have some people already voting. So right now it's 50-50 on the results. And here's really
and keep in mind, what we're asking you is, when you hear this story, what is your first instinctive, immediate thought that enters your mind about the gender of the doctor? And if you've heard this story before, think back. What was your first initial thought back then? Was it the first thing you thought male, or did you think female?
So 17 people, 68%, voted male, and 32% voted female. And I can attest, like, the first time I heard this, I was like, how is this possible? And I also thought male.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the thing is that the doctor in this riddle is the mother. And so, but the majority of us, our mind in system one goes like doctor. We hear the word doctor and we think man. Some might not have thought, maybe you thought, is the father not dead? I thought the father was dead. Maybe you said, oh, it's the stepfather, or he has two fathers, or, like people even go further out and becomes a little bit insane how far out we go before we think mother. I'm going to close down this, and I hope you can still see my screen. The interesting part about this is that's actually our unconscious mind playing with us as well. And that's one of the challenges of achieving inclusive decision making, inclusive cultures, inclusive interactions, is we jump to these conclusions really fast. Stories globally, and we're not the only ones sharing this. This is one of those stories that just keeps spreading and has done so for decades. 75% think man when hearing the word doctor. And so we jump to conclusion, even that when we know that the majority of women coming out of the majority of universities and medical schools worldwide are women, even that we've met really competent doctors who are women. So with our rational mind, we can know this, but we still jump to conclusion. So for Lisa and I, having worked in this for about in this line of work for 20 years, I mean, what is it, like 10 years ago I heard the story first time, I jumped right in. I was all over the place with man. Who is it? Like before I even thought mother. And so regardless of how much we know about this, we all have these unconscious bias and mental shortcuts. And the reason why we wanted to show you this is that we all do it, regardless of how much we know. We all have this gap between these two brain systems. So even though we know something, we have really good intentions of being inclusive, what we do and how we perceive people or perceive the world or a problem or an issue is something different. And we need to find ways to close that gap. And I wanted to show you again how powerful this is. And again, some of you might know the Adelson illusion. But if you look at square A and B here, and you will see that A looks like the darkest gray shade, right? Where if I change the frame, you see something different. This is reality. The B and A are 100% identical gray shades. And now you can see it because I framed it up differently. But if I take it away, you can't see it. So even though you know with your rational mind, system 2, the conscious mind, these two are identical. A and B are identical. You can't see it because system 1 is taking over. And system 1 takes over as soon as there's a pattern. Here there are two patterns, a checkboard pattern, and that B is in a row of light gray shades, right? That's the same happening in our workplaces and in our communities. Whenever there's something our mind recognizes, it will jump to conclusion that that's the best solution. Imagine that people share ideas, different ideas for how we could make some changes that would be better for all of us. We listen to the ideas, but our unconscious mind is going to go sort it out and find the pattern. So it's very unlikely that we're actually going to think that the new ideas, the radical ideas, are any good. They're not competent. We're going to exclude them instead of include them, because we're going to look for the pattern. We're going to find something that we recognize, and that is going to make our brain jump to conclusion that's the best idea. And then we end up having something similar as we tried on early on. When we hire people, we tend to hire the same people, somebody who communicates like the ones who were previous in that position, or looks like the others, or is from the same university or educational background. So we keep going for these patterns. What we have to do is design around it so that we can actually make some different evaluations and different decisions, and also create a more inclusive culture by seeing things that we can't see. We have to help each other see what we can't see. So it's about closing that gap by design and by nudging. And to Ingrid's point in the beginning, training and education is not enough, because we tend to appeal too much to the rational mind, relying on our rational conscious mind to do the work, when most of what we do is happening in the unconscious mind. So our values, our knowledge, our willpower, our good intentions are not enough, and actually can even backfire. Because when we think and have the self-perception, I've been trained in this, I know something about unconscious bias, then I'm not going to do it. But it's actually the opposite. The more we know, the more it can actually paralyze our brain, making us rely even more on the mental shortcuts. if we have perceived or established a self-perception, we're the good people, we're working for inclusion, we're not excluding, we might actually end up giving our mind a moral license that's going to make us do the opposite. Discriminate more without even knowing, excluding new ideas or new perspectives, go with similar others instead of diversity, and we're going to end up reproducing status quo, homogeneity, and exclusion instead of the inclusion that we so much need more than ever.
So Tinna, that's
so I'll stop for now.
Yeah, we've got 10 minutes left, and we've got a lot of energy happening.
Good.
I'd love to hear kind of you've been very active giving some examples in the chat, and I've been trying to respond to each one and give some examples. There's some in the guidebook, but if there's something perhaps that you want further covered or that's not covered in the chat, open up and share with us around a particular challenge you're facing, and we can direct you with some designs to respond to that. Tinna, what I would say is what would be really relevant is one of the first ones about the mindset that diversity equals somehow a lessening of performance or quality, and that we need to go the route of quotas. And a good example is the inclusion nudge that we have around the 70% versus the 30% example that you had in your organization. So that could be a really cool one to share.
Yeah.
And I think there's also a framing of the language also that needs to happen there too. So there's a process and then a framing piece as well.
So quite a lot of the organizations where I've been working, there's been this really strong narrative about gender equality being reduced to gender being only women. And then it ended up being this misunderstanding that making a balanced leadership team or making sure everybody had equal opportunities to advance and contribute were somehow misunderstood as, okay, what, we're going to have to help the women, they can't do it themselves. And then this whole mindset of pity kind of emerged, or annoyings. People got really annoyed. Why would we hire a woman because she was a woman? So it was like total misunderstanding around this. So to change that narrative, what we did was we changed the way we communicated about the targets that we set for gender balanced teams. And also the target we set for getting more women into leadership positions. We still had it as a target, but we flipped it and say, well, let's look at the data showing how is a high performing team composed. And it turned out that data showed, and research showed, that if you had maximum 70% of the same gender in a team, it performed better than if the majority of a gender would, take up more space in the team. And so it's back to that whole research about critical mass of 30%. But instead of focusing on the minority, we flipped it and said, well, a high performing team should maximum have 70% of the same gender. That was what fit to our pipeline. So if your pipeline was more gender balanced, you would, of course, match it to that, saying maximum 60% of the same gender. But we also did it on ethnicity. We did it on educational background. We did it on many other parameters, and saying maximum 70% of the same. And that absolutely resonated with leaders in the entire organization, because they all wanted a high performing team. And that's actually how we changed the narrative about gender equality being about fixing the women or helping the women. It became about making sure we have access to full, pool of talent, that we get high performing teams, that we can innovate better and faster. And that resource oriented narrative had a really strong impact. So we never talked about quota anymore, but we actually started reaching the targets.
Thanks, Tinna. And for everyone who may be having the guidebook and looking it up, this is maximum 70% homogeneity team composition and target. And so that's in the guidebook. There was another challenge that was put in the chat around the pace of change. That could be the perception of diversity, equity, inclusion, pace of change is slow, and how that contrasts to the organization being fast. Well, one thing about nudging is that these are small, seemingly small changes. They are based on deep work that you're doing to analyze the data that shows you what the challenge is, where the choice points are within the interaction or the process, and then you design an approach that may be either targeting around commitment and buy-in to increase that. It may be around how the concept is framed up, and then it may be around process design. But a lot of these inclusion nudges can be put into place immediately. So for example, in meeting facilitations, sharing and getting access to diverse perspectives, and breaking them up into groups, and I tell my story to one of you and you tell me your story or input on the problem solving we're doing, and then we report out each other's perspective or experience. Or doing the technique of silent brainstorming, where ideas are all written down individually. We all write our ideas on sticky notes and they get posted on the wall, and then the focus is on the idea. I just give these quickly because there is long-term systemic work that does happen in diversity and inclusion, and that could lead to us getting into a stuck pattern of perception of this work is really slow and far out. And are some very quick actions that could be immediately put into practice, and you start calling it out and talking about the impact, and then getting this larger ramification of others following that pattern and hearing about the successes, and the momentum picks up.
And so the reason why we call those two examples Lisa just said a nudge is because as the meeting facilitator, you don't have to talk about, let's make sure that we're all inclusive of each other's perspectives. Let's make sure that we're not self-silencing. You don't have to talk about inclusion, diversity, equity, group dynamics. You can design the facilitation so we're automatically inclusive, create psychological safety in the culture to speak up and share your opinion or your perspective on a problem or decision we have to make together, or a task we have to solve together. So that's the essence of this, redesigning the process, the facilitation, more than appealing to the rational mind by talking about it. And that's why that's a nudge to get people to be more inclusive, listen differently to each other, and not be so focused on, as Lisa said, who's the person sharing the idea or the input. So it doesn't matter what skin color people have, or what pitch of tone they have, or if they're a woman or a man, or introvert or extrovert, or old and young, or it doesn't matter. Focus is on the diverse perspectives being shared.
There've been a couple of questions. What's a guidebook, etc. So I've typed in the website. It's not here on this slide, Tinna.
It's here.
Inclusion. There we go. And these are the guidebooks. There was some question about what are the guidebooks. So as a change maker, we would recommend the full guidebook for you. But also, if you want to have a small taster, or you want to share with others across your organization, we've released the Action Guide series, which are the books in the background there. The full guidebook has over 100 examples that come from our work, that come from Joanne Morris's work, who's here on the call with us, that come from people like you around the world who have shared. And this is the global initiative that we founded over 7 years ago. And it's about sharing what has worked in our work to make inclusion the default and the norm, how we change, realizing those hidden patterns so that, we as a change maker are not the one being blamed, but the patterns are revealed and felt in an impactful way that then leads to process redesigns, and also can be set up as a framing perceptions piece. And so all three of these examples, feel the need, process redesign, and framing perceptions, are covered in the Inclusion Nudges guidebook. And then the smaller ones have 30 examples in each one, targeted for specific audiences. Tinna and I also just launched the blog on the platform. So we're regularly writing articles, and you have several there. We're updating monthly. If there's a particular topic that you're interested in, also drop us a note and we'll investigate and look in how we start writing a future article about an idea that you may want to explore more. And we encourage you to sign up so you can stay informed. We don't want to bombard your email, so it'll only be a monthly message coming out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, so it's about empowering each other. So we also encourage you to share if you have examples of how you've been nudging people to get moving on this and make it happen. So this only happens when we share with each other what works, and are able to design, script it out so others can do it too.
Yeah, and that was our intention, to empower all of us as a community of change makers to be more effective in the work that we're doing and not get bogged down in the many challenges that we faced, as you called out earlier too, and we know from our own work as well.
Yeah.
So by joining forces, we can make this transformation needed.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you liked this, please give us a thumbs up. Also, if you want to know about upcoming episodes, check out our program at theschoolofbecoming.org. You can attend any of our live sessions for free, interact with the speakers, as well as other people who are interested in the subject. I'm looking forward to welcome you to one of our future sessions.